So today, we're taking a look at a bad situation meant for good. That's going to be what we're looking at today. It's not going to be normally what we normally see from the series. We're taking a look at something completely different. This was something that I was just reading as I was going through my devotions, and I was just trying to figure out what to preach on tonight, and this just popped out at me. It's a different little passage from a common story that we look at all the time, the story of Joseph, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But I was just reading through that section, and there was this passage that popped out to me, and I thought I would share it tonight as something that was interesting to me and helpful to me, and I think it will be helpful to you. But first, I was thinking about this, and what we're going to be looking at today has a lot to do with mindset, and that got me thinking. I really like podcasts. Anybody else really like podcasts in here? Who listens to a lot of podcasts? Me? I even got my AirPods here in my back pocket, right here. I put these on like all the time. I'm always listening to a podcast. I think they're excellent. You listen to everyone. I can listen to pretty much anybody talk about anything. I love it. I mean, think about it. You have the smartest people on the planet talking about the thing that they're most passionate about, that they're an expert in. How cool is that? You got them in your ear and you're listening to them. I like listening to people, that maybe someone that's really rich, and you hear their mindset and you wonder, what is the mindset that they had to get to that place? Or you listen to an astronaut talk and you're like, what's the mindset that took them to want to go out of space? Or what's the mindset behind this athlete? Maybe an athlete you're listening to, or this CEO, or maybe it's some kind of preacher that you look up to, and you're thinking, what's the mindset behind these people? And you get to spend an hour, 2 hours sometimes with these people in your ears, and you get to hear about them, hear about where they came from, hear about their stories, their mindset. Mindset is quite a powerful thing. What's a mindset? When we think about a mindset really drives a lot of your purpose. It definitely reacts in your actions, doesn't it? You can have a mindset before doing something. I think often about sports and think about these athletes that do sports professionally. They have a very strong and rigid mindset. Maybe you see, and I enjoy something seeing, like, what is it that someone will do before a race? Maybe if we're talking about Formula One or something like this. What is it that they do? What's the regiment before they get into the car? Or what's the mindset before they get on to play for basketball? You might have heard the basketball player, very, very popular basketball player, Kobe Bryant. He had a mindset that was very powerful mindset. He even called it the Mamba mentality. You ever heard of that? The Mamba mentality? That mentality that you don't stop. You work hard, you do your best, you try to be the best that you can at whatever it is that you're doing, and you're not going to quit. And he had this mentality that was so strong. He worked harder than anybody else. When you hear people talk about Kobe, they talk about him as somebody that worked so hard, that was the hardest worker, the person that woke up at like 5 o'clock in the morning and started training right away. And he was one of the hardest working people that there was in basketball. And that's the mentality that he had to be the best at what he had. He has got this famous quote. I didn't write it down, but it was something along the lines that he cannot see himself fail, or something like this. Like, he cannot accept failure in his own life. Therefore, he tries his best to overcome that. That's a mindset. When we're looking at that, that's what shaped who Kobe was. That's what shaped his legacy when we look at different people like that. Now, when I'm looking at here in the Bible story, we're taking a look at the person of Joseph. When I think of Joseph, wouldn't it be cool to sit down with Joseph and interview him in our modern day with some microphones and be able to hear his podcast? What is it that his mindset was? Be able to hear, what is it that made or drove him to do the things that he did? When you think about Joseph, what do you think about? I don't think about someone that had an easy life. What do you think about when you think about Joseph? Joseph, the one with the colorful coat. And there's a lot of things that happened with him. You ever heard of this story from the Bible? What is it that you think about when you think of Joseph? I think of someone that went through a lot of suffering. What do you think, Tom? Yeah, he did definitely the right thing over and over and over, and he got punished so many times. We're going to look through all of those as a recap. What's something else you might think about when you think of Joseph? Yeah, Michael. 100%. I got that written right in here. The attitude that he had, even though he had to suffer so much, was impeccable. So what is the mindset that drives this person? Yeah. Very forgiving. Yeah. And you look at the end when he was in charge of all of Egypt, and he was a very powerful person, and his brothers come, what does he do? He forgives them, right? He had this very forgiving attitude, even though they had done awful things to him. So we're going to be looking at through here. I want to break this passage down so we can understand a little bit of what his mindset was. When we think about Joseph, I want you to think about his mindset. What was it that's driving him throughout here, and how God used him to be able to use him through his downs, through his highs, and all that. But first, I want to go back a little bit on Joseph's story, just so that we can recap a little bit about someone that was mistreated, someone that got a lot of wrong, someone that was misunderstood. So let's go ahead and let's go through some quick context. So let's start in Genesis 37. So if you got your Bibles, why don't you go to Genesis 37? This is just a quick recap of things that happened to him. Because as we think about these things, I want you to be thinking about these things as far as in your life too. Do you ever, I sometimes when I read these here, and as we're reading them, think about Joseph as a person like you and I. Like we sometimes raise him up to a different standard, but he was just a man like us. So think about what is it that you would have been experiencing in those situations? How would you have reacted? Do you think that Joseph himself ever wondered, maybe ever questioned, why me? Why is this happening to me? Why are all these bad things happening to me? But God is still in control. What's going on? So think about that as we see here, because it's gonna help us as we go through. Main goal before we get into this, just so you know where we're going, is today's passage we're going to be looking at Joseph as his finally and his insight. We're going to see his mindset and how he acted, why he acted that way, so that we can understand all the stuff that he went through. So let's jump into the first one. It was Genesis 37 and verse 28. If you're there with me, Genesis 37, verse 28. First here, I want to just jump into the story after this is when he gets sold. Okay, so he's already gone with his brothers. Remember, these are his brothers. And he goes to his brothers to check up on them. And this is what the brothers do. They throw him in a pit, and then they come up with this plan. And this is what happens in Genesis 37, verse 28. Then there passed by Midianite merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they brought Joseph into Egypt. Brought Joseph into Egypt. So he got sold. Now imagine that. Imagine getting sold by your family, his brothers, a sibling, even someone that you care about, selling you for a couple pieces of dollar because they hated you that much. Now imagine, just process that a little bit. Think about someone that you know is close to you, maybe family member, maybe not even that close to you. Now imagine what it would feel like for them to sell you for a little bit of money just to get rid of you because they hated you that much. That's a lot to process. Now imagine Joseph's mindset as he's going through this here. After that happens, Joseph is in Egypt. And you know the story, but we're just reviewing some of it. Joseph is in Egypt and does well, and he's entrusted with a lot, with Potiphar, because he's sold to Potiphar, someone that was in charge of a lot of things. But then Potiphar's wife tricks and lies about him, and he says something that's not true. And then look what happens here. As this is in Genesis 39. If you want to skip down there, Genesis 39, verse 2. We'll take a little bit of a look there. This is in verse 2. It says, "And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian." Okay, so now we understand that God was with him through it all. Now, let's take a look at here. After he gets lied to, he gets imprisoned. Did I skip a verse? I think we might have. No, I think we're okay. Let's jump into where we see Joseph is in prison now after being lied about. In verse 37, verse 19 to 21, it says, "And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did the servant to me, and his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound. And he was there in prison." Now look at verse 21. "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper in prison." Again, we see it says the Lord was with him and he gave him a lot of favor. But imagine that. After you come in this, somebody lies about you, says something that's not true, and then you get to reap the rewards, or what's the opposite of a benefit? Not the benefit, I don't know what it's called, of going to prison. He goes to prison for something he did not do. So now you've got someone that's being betrayed, someone that's lied to, someone that's been sold by, and now he has to live in prison for something he had not done. After he's in prison, he gains favor in the prison, as you know, and he then is with the chief butler after helping him with a dream. But then this guy that he helped him, after he asks him, forgets him. Look at what it says here in Genesis 40, verse 14. Genesis 40, one verse over, or chapter over, verse 14, talks about this section. It says, "But think on me when it shall be well with thee." He's talking to the butler. "And show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house." He's asking, please, when you go out of jail and you go back to helping Pharaoh, please remember me. Remember me. But look what happens here in a couple verses later. Verse 23, again in Genesis 40, verse 23, it says, yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph or forget him. Now imagine that. After all of this, he got forgotten. He was in prison. He helped this man. He goes out, tells him, remember me, and he goes out, and he goes back to normal, and he forgets Joseph in prison. So now imagine what he's thinking about now. He's someone that was betrayed, and now he's forgotten. Now imagine this. I don't know how long he would have been there, but imagine the things that he's thinking about while he's in there, in prison. Did God forget me? Why am I here? What is it that I did to deserve this? Why did I get sold by my family? Why did I raise to power and then go all the way down to prison and stay in here? Why did they forget me? All these questions I'm sure is going through his mind. But he eventually gets out of prison and rises back up to power. And this is the power that we understand that he gets in Egypt. Look at here, if we jump down to Genesis 41, verse 41. Joseph rises to power once again. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. So he gets back out, he gets favor with the Pharaoh, and he gets in charge of a lot of portions of over Egypt. Now, all these things that happen, of course, he's wondering why. Now, through it all, we just see a person with an incredible character, someone that was doing the right thing despite the circumstances because he always trusted God and the greater plan that he had. Now, that's pretty easy for us to say when we look at this passage and say, oh, Joseph trusted God and his plan. It's very easy to do because, God was with him and he helped him through it. And he knew the greater plan, so you should also. That's pretty easy for us to tell someone else, that's going through a bad situation. Just do what Joseph did, trust the greater plan, it's going to work out for the better. That's pretty easy for us to say, but when you're in the situation, you're going through it, it's not quite that easy. Now, why do you think, this is a question that maybe we can discuss a little bit, why do you think it's much harder to do the right thing when we're in circumstances that are not ideal? Joseph was not in ideal circumstances up until now when he's back in power. This has been all unideal. Why do you think it's harder to do the right thing when our circumstances around us are not ideal, are not preferred? Why do you think? Tracy? Yep. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, you're not running normal, right? You're off kilter, like you said. You're feeling unbalanced. Maybe your routine has been thrown out the window, and you feel like you're just trying to get by, right? Yeah, Mondo. Mm, like a victim, almost looking at yourself like, why is it happening to me? Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's very true. We can look at a scenario and wonder and almost treat it like a victim. Like we have the victim mentality that why me? Why did I get this? The woe is me. I don't deserve this. I deserve better than this. Our mind can definitely go there. Why else? I saw, Tom, you had one. Yeah. Mm. Okay, yes. Sure. Oh, isn't that interesting? That's cool. How influenced you are by your surroundings, right? Yeah, I've seen some of those in a funny sense, like a prank sense, where everybody in a situation puts on a silly hat or something, and then the random dude has to put on the silly hat because he wants to be part of the situation. Yes, I've seen that. Very interesting kind of experiment. Michael, I saw your hand come up a little bit. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It is just easier to do that. Some of the things I wrote here is sometimes it's easier to just blame everything around us, blame the circumstances for our actions, right? Because often what we're struggling with is doing the right thing was just an action. So often we blame our bad actions or our bad response to the situation on our circumstances. Well, it's because this happened, or it's because the situation happened, or it's because this person betrayed me, is that I did this wrong thing, or it's because, I don't know, there's so many things. And we're all facing something difficult right now in this moment. It might be small, it might be big, and it can always be something that we can blame, look towards, so that we can blame that rather than looking towards God's plan. Another one that I have written down here is it gives us a proper excuse to act wrongly. Sometimes we can look at a situation and say, because this person did something, I can then do this. And it gives us an excuse to act wrong. Or because the situation is so bad, I'm allowed to do this or cheat my way through this situation. Because it gives us an excuse. It excuses our character, it excuses our actions. But Joseph did not do that from what we can tell from everything that Scripture has given us. So we want to learn what Joseph is doing here that allowed him, what mindset did he have, in the same way that these athletes have mindset that allows them to succeed so much in a game. What is it that Joseph had here that allowed him, that we can learn from, to be able to have a similar response that Joseph did? One more thing before we get into our main passage here that we're going to be really breaking down, where Joseph gives us this answer. This is an important part, because this sets up a little bit of why Joseph responded the way he did. If we fast forward in the story, you know the story. Joseph is in charge. He's in charge of these things. He does a great thing with the food. He gathers a lot of food for the famine. He gets ready for the famine. A big famine comes across the land, and then a bunch of nations come to get help from Joseph, because Joseph is in charge of this, and then he gives out the food to different people. And in this situation, you get his brothers that are in the famine coming to Egypt to get food from him. And this is a very interesting situation where he helps them. Joseph then reveals that he's Joseph, his brother, that they got sold, that they had thought that maybe he had died somewhere. And he reveals himself to be who the person is, and he forgives them, and he says, it's okay, I forgive you for what you've done. They become a happy family. They got the dad over. Everything's fine in the world. But here's what everything changes. This is the interesting part in the story, the one that I was reading on a couple days ago for my Devo. This is where Jacob, the dad, dies. Okay, so everything's great in the family. They've forgiven each other. But then Jacob dies. I want you to look at this in Genesis 49, verse 33. If you got your Bibles, look at this. This is really cool. Not this part specifically, but this will set it up. Jacob dies in verse 33 of chapter 49. So Jacob blesses all his sons. There's a passage where he goes and blesses all his sons. And after he blesses all his sons, he dies. And this is where it says, and when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he gathers up his feet into the bed, and yielded up the ghost, and was gathered up unto his people. So after this, he dies, and then after this, if you keep reading, you'll notice that Joseph has a funeral, and it's a very sorrowful moment. And after all this happens here, this is our passage here, because now no one's left. There's just Joseph and his brothers, and there's no dad around. Now, dads have a form of influence or structure to a family that everybody revolves around. Isn't that true? When we have someone, maybe it's a grandparent, and that's the grandparent that everybody looks up to in a family to keep the order, okay? And when that dies off, then we're left with uncertainty. Often that's the case. And here's what happens. There's uncertainty in this family situation. The brothers start wondering, what's going to happen to us now that dad's gone? Will Joseph finally repay for all the evil that we did to him by selling him? Or is he going to keep us? Is he going to still forgive us? Or is he going to retaliate now that dad's not around? Look what happens here. This is the main passage I want you to look at. Genesis 50. We're in Genesis 50, verse 15, all the way to verse 18. So let's read there. It says in verse 15, and when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will pre-adventure, so probably, this is what it's saying. Joseph will probably hate us and will certainly requite. I think that's how you say it. It's basically return, okay? So like give us back all the evil that we did to him. So I'll read that again. Will pre-adventure hate us and will certainly requite us all the evil which we did unto him. So then they start speculating here. Now that he's dead, he's probably going to hate us all, and he's probably going to return all the evil that we did to him in the first place. Verse 16, and they sent a messenger unto Joseph, saying, now imagine this, they can't even go up and tell him. They sent a messenger to say this. Thy father did command before he died, they're talking about Jacob, saying, this is what Jacob supposedly said. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe they're lying, maybe he did say it, I'm not sure. But this is what they're saying that Jacob said. So shall ye say unto Joseph, forgive, I pray thee now, the trespasses of thy brethren and their sins, for they did unto thee evil, and now we pray thee, forgive their trespass, of the servants of the God of thy father. And Joseph wept when they spake unto him. Verse 18, and his brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we be thy servants. So they're trying to protect themselves here. They're setting up themselves so that they have protection from Joseph, someone very powerful, and they're wondering what is Joseph's response going to be. And they come up with this idea here. Maybe Jacob said, I looked into it. It seems like a controversial thing whether Jacob, yes or not. We're unsure if he actually said this. I think maybe they're just making it up just to save themselves from Joseph and give a reason to Joseph to give them mercy. But they say, Jacob said, you should have mercy and forgive us so that, the evil things that we did to you, don't do the evil things back to us now that Dad's gone. And this is where it gets interesting. This is where we see Joseph's response, where we get a little bit of the insight into what is running Joseph, what his mindset is. We look at the main passage here that follows. In Genesis 50, verse 19 to 21. This is where we see Joseph's final response. This is where we're going to get most of what we can apply to our lives of how we can act like Joseph here. And Joseph says in response to them, it says in verse 19 of chapter 50, and Joseph said unto them, fear not, for am I in the place of God? So he questions them at the beginning. He says, don't worry, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Am I acting as of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me. You did all these evil things, you thought evil against me. But God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. Verse 21, now therefore fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly to them. Look at that reply. That reply after everything that he's been through, his reply to them is, am I supposed to act like God and outweigh the balances of life? No, I'm not God. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to fight and do that for you. Instead, you meant it evil for me, but God meant it for good. Look what God did with all that bad situation. God meant it for good. You can see that the log line, if you follow it, what God has done to him. Through his life, he has a past history of how God has brought him through and being able to bring him out of those bad situations. He says that lots of people were saved, are brought alive, and through that day, and now therefore fear ye not, I'm going to take care of you. He says, I'm going to nourish you. I'm going to take care of your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly to them. That was his actions that he did. I love that first line where it says, I am not in the place of God. Don't worry. It reminds me actually of a passage that we see later in Exodus, in the story of Moses when he's running away from the Egyptians and everybody's there. And they're saying, how are we going to be able to handle this situation? You remember that story where Moses is at the Red Sea, about to cross, and all the Egyptians are coming after him? And Moses, something interesting. He says in Exodus 14:14, he says, the Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. He says, that's not your battle. God's in control. He's going to be the one that fights for you. And we see this throughout the Bible, that even Jesus, when he says that it's not for us to fight, but that is for God to do, to bring justice and to judge. So when we understand that here, this instance gives us a clue into the mindset of Joseph. His outlook was properly aligned with God's plan. God had a plan, and his mindset was properly aligned with it. Now, this is going to come back for us to understand it, because God's plan is God's plan. We can either be properly aligned with it and agree with it, or we can be out of God's plan, but God's plan still does not change. God's plan is God's plan, and his will is his will, and it will happen whether we're with it or we're not with it. And his place in God's will was because he was properly aligned with God's plan. So let's take a look at the first thing so we break it down. A bad situation. Joseph's mindset. Let's break down this little passage here and see how we can apply it to our lives. The first thing that we see is a bad situation. All of us in this room will have experienced, or maybe are experiencing a bad situation. And this could be something tragic. It could be something that you're going through, a hard situation, something that's hard. Give me some examples of something that maybe you have experienced, are experiencing, or something that will feel as if you're in this situation. Maybe something that is difficult. Maybe give me something broad, not specifics. Maybe betrayal of someone, something that we would experience, not specifically Joseph, because Joseph and us are a big contrast here in the two, so that we can understand what we're talking about. Give me one example here. One I think of is being lied to by someone we care about. That's one that hurts a lot. What's another one? Maybe loss of a family, right? That's one that we will experience that will be down. What's another one here? Yeah. Okay, for sure. There you go. What's another one? It could be anything, really, anything bad that happens that we're looking at. Maybe one that I think of sometimes is hopes of something and that doesn't happen. So unfulfilled hope. Maybe that's a good way to think about it. Or hoping that something happens and something else happens. That can sometimes be disappointing or upsetting. You were going to say something, Tom? Betrayal. Yeah, for sure. Betrayal. Being betrayed by someone. Yeah, Karen. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, jobs can be very hard, and it can definitely disrupt what is happening in your life. That can be a bad situation. When we're looking at this, I want you to understand here that as we're going through these things, that everybody in this room will experience it. I experience this. I have things that I'm going through. And when we recognize that there is a bad situation, we have to understand how to be able to react to it. So he recognizes that there were situations. He starts the passage by saying in Genesis 50, verse 20, the first part, it says, "But as for you, ye thought evil against me." He recognizes it first. He recognizes that there is a bad situation, something that was evil towards him. The reality is that life is very much like this, and we may not all experience something like Joseph went through, but the truth is we are going to experience that life is hard, unfair, difficult, doesn't go our way, painful, betrayal, like we said. We're going to experience grief, and we're most certainly going to experience these things. So understanding how to react to it is going to be important. When we keep going through here, we have to remember here the second point that will be helpful for us. Let me just make sure I'm in the right spot here. That's right. Genesis 50, verse 20, verse A says, "But as for you, ye thought evil against me." But this is my favorite part of the verse, where it gets to, it says, "But God." You see where Joseph says that? "But as for you," he's talking about his brothers, "ye thought evil against me." So when we look at a bad situation, we can say that situation was bad, but God. And this is where it gets great. This is an opportunity. This is the second part. The opportunity comes to us where we can see it as an opportunity here. It says, "But God." So you can say, I had a bad day, but God. I experienced loss, but God. I was betrayed, but God. God, remember, God is greater than anything we will ever experience. That's something that I have to remind myself through life as I go through situations that are not ideal, things that I wish would happen and didn't happen. You can always say that, but God is greater than anything that we will experience. Joseph leads down this mindset here with but God. First, we had the bad situation. Now we have an opportunity. Let's read the second part of chapter 50, verse 20. It says, but God meant it unto good. So he meant it unto good to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Joseph makes that incredible statement here that summarizes his mindset. He understands that God could use it for good. Joseph realized that though there was a lot of evil, God had meant it for good. And please don't misunderstand, because sometimes we can misunderstand that and say that God was the architect behind the evil things, or God was the one that brought these evil things. No, God used the situation, the bad situation, for good. There's another verse that we're going to get to in a minute that maybe you know, in Romans 8:28. So if you want to turn there, we're going to read that in just a minute before we get there through that. But Joseph understood that through all the bad, God brought him to Egypt. God placed him in power. God gave him influence, power over Egypt again, wisdom in the famine, and eventually he allowed him to help his family along with so many other people in that famine situation. God had an incredible plan already laid out even before Joseph had even realized it, even before Joseph would realize and that God was working it all out for good. Now this, again, does not mean that God caused that situation, but he would weave his will into that to be able to do it. And often I hear this and it sounds like an easy way out, and that's not what we're getting at today, where you would say to someone else, because this is something that maybe you've heard before, you have a bad day, and someone will say, "Oh, but God will work it out for good." Now that's being insensitive to the situation. That's not what this passage is telling you. But when we realize here what it's saying, it's going to change your mindset about that situation. Let's take a look at Romans 8:28. Look what it says in Romans 8:28. It reiterates in the New Testament what they were going through here in the Old Testament. It says there in Romans 8:28, it says, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. God has already promised to believers the things that they will work out for good. We already understand the ending to the story. We've read the Bible. We know what will happen when God comes back. God will carry you, guaranteed, if we believe in him and we have accepted him as a personal Savior. God will carry you through the finish line and accomplish all that he said that he would do, despite your outlook. But your attitude and your outlook will make the difference in our involvement in God's plan, our joy, and the blessing and the actions that we do in this life here. And it will make a difference. I was trying to think of an idea here of how to think about this, and I was thinking about a river. A river has a flow. Think about a river, or maybe a lazy river in like an amusement park, but a river has a flow. It goes one direction, and you cannot change the flow of that river. It will continuously go no matter how hard you try. You can't redirect the river to go the other way, right? Now, when you're participating in that river, let's just say it's like a lazy river, and you're going down the river, okay, you can either swim with the river, okay, and that'll be quite a good experience because it'll push you down the right direction, or you can try swimming against the river. Anybody ever tried running against the current of a river? I've tried swimming against the current. You don't really move, do you? You just kind of stay in one spot. If not, you actually end up going the wrong direction that you want to go in. It's not a very pleasant experience. It doesn't matter how much or how hard you try to swim the other direction, the river will not change direction. The river will continue to move. And I kind of think a little bit, it's not a perfect analogy, but it makes us understand how God's plan, God's will continue no matter what we do. It will continue. He's going to fulfill everything that he says. All the prophecies that he says is going to happen. Everything that he says is going to go exactly the way that God plans it. And we can either accept that and go with God, kind of like downriver, or we can fight him in everything that we do, and it's going to be the same situation. We're going to have a miserable experience throughout life as we fight God through it. And you can imagine those situations, because when we have a bad situation, it can lead to all the things that we said at the beginning of the message, where it leads us to feeling resentment. We leave feeling, what's the word? Like a victim, and that changes our attitude. It changes our actions. It changes how we treat those around us. It changes how we treat our children, how we act to them. It changes everything around us. So it will finish, the route will finish regardless, but how much you try and participate will impact our involvement in God's plan. It will impact, of course, your joy, the blessings in your life, and our actions and how we respond to it. Now, I think sometimes when I think about Joseph, I believe that Joseph, if he had not chosen to be part of God's plan and seen all God's that he could do through his life, maybe Joseph wouldn't have had this story. Maybe God would have raised someone else instead of Joseph, and that would have been the person that we would have been reading. And maybe Joseph would have been the story of what could have been, and we would be reading his story in a very different way. Maybe kind of like we read the story of a Jonah. When we think about Jonah and what he accomplished. Jonah's the one with the big fish, the whale. And he doesn't want to do God's will. He tries running literally against the current. He tries going the different way. And then God forces him to go to Nineveh. And he does the thing, but he does it kind of begrudgingly. Is that the right word? He doesn't want to do it, right? He does it the wrong way with the wrong attitude. And then he's bitter. He sits underneath this plant, and he's bitter about everything. But does God still do what he said he was going to do? He still does. But he's not in the right attitude. So when we see these two characters and compare them, you see Jonah and then Joshua here. Very big difference in how we view them, how we read their story, how we understand their joy that they must have felt through God's plan. Jonah refused to do what he wanted to do, but God still was able to use him. So the last thing that we want to be able to understand here is a choice. Everybody was with a choice. Joseph had a choice. Jonah had a choice. We have a choice when we have these bad situations happen to us. Joseph, along with you and I, have a choice to look at our situation and react accordingly. Either we can do it grudgingly with a bad attitude and resentment, or we can have a mindset like Joseph. We already know that Joseph did choices, and that affected his actions. You can see the actions that he did at the end. If I read that again, if I go back up. Where is it here? There it is, in verse 21, when Joseph says, "Now therefore, fear not, I will nourish you." That's the action. "I will nourish you with your little ones." And he comforted them, and he spake kindly to them. You know how hard it is to speak kindly to someone after they've done something so evil to you? That's a hard thing to do. But he did that regardless of what they had done through God's help. with trusting God's plan, with having God's help, and being close to God throughout it all. You can see that often throughout the story. We can go back to the passages where it says, and God was with him, and God gave him favor, and God was with him. I can imagine the life that Joseph had with God as his friend throughout life would have been very different than if he would have not decided to go with God's will. He nourishes them, comforts them, he speaks kindly to them. And this verse, of course, could even be its own message. We could even look at these three things and apply those to our lives. But he acted with kindness because his mindset and his outlook on God's overall plan was correct. So whatever it is that you're going through, it's hard, and we can recognize it for what it is and say that was meant for evil, that was a bad situation, but God brought me through that amount of pain, but God can do it. That person lied to me and that was not nice, but God will be able to do that. And maybe you'll wonder in that situation, as I have in the past, what could God do with a situation like this? This situation was so bad, what could God ever do with that situation? And what I found is that when I leave that planning up to God, he will always show me that there is a situation that God can use that in your life later on. I've had situations in my life back a long time ago, recent situations where I think that was so terrible, how could God ever use that? And maybe it's in the most unusual way where I look in my life and that situation has given me compassion maybe for other people that have gone through that situation, has given me insight into a situation to be able to give advice in, has given me a different outlook on things. Maybe it's given me a type of sorrow that I did not know existed, but now I know exists, and now that helps me to be able to understand. It helps us through that if we allow God to do it. But if we hold resentment and say, why did God do that to me? Why is it that I had to go through that? Why is it easier for other people? And to me, it's not easy. God knows what we're going through. God hears you. God will use that situation when we choose to trust him. So I want to leave you with a thought here. Even when bad things happen, and there will always be bad things, there's always an opportunity to trust God in that situation. Through the bad situation, at the end of the bad situation, and moving forward, that God can use that for good. And you may not be in control of your situation. We can't sometimes control it, but you can always choose your mindset and choose how that will, and that mindset will choose and shape the actions that we will be able to possibly help other people, help ourselves, our situation, and our relationship with God. Something that I know will help me as I move forward. I hope that helps you as you even think about Joseph, as you read his story, be able to understand his story a little bit better and how Joseph was able to go through it all with God's help.